The Conjoined twins, who made up their own strange religion in the Ozarks, Missouri in 1884. There was a place in Tenney County, deep in the dark hollows, where morning mist clung to old oaks and neighbors lived miles apart. There, being alone could turn faith into something terrible. The Ozark Mountains held secrets as dark as their deepest caves in 1884. The story I'm going to tell you starts in these forgotten hills, where two sisters lived by rules that no civilized person could understand. People in the Finch family's small community had been whispering about them for years, but they had become more and more withdrawn from it. But in 1885, when a young circuit doctor made a routine house call, he found something that went against all laws of nature and decency. The evidence he found would lead investigators to a family Bible that was so badly marked that even experienced police officers refused to talk about what was inside for decades. What made two women write their own twisted gospel? How did they make sense of things that would make tough prosecutors cry? And what was found in that cabin that made the whole town want justice? By 1886, a crowded courtroom would learn things about human evil that made them question what evil really is. Get ready for what's coming next, because what these sisters thought was their divine calling will make you question what faith and family really are. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from. If you're brave enough to go on this journey, subscribe so you don't miss stories that show the worst parts of human nature. On a cold February morning in 1886, Prosecutor William Hartwell walked into the packed Tenney County Courthouse. The brass hinges of the door creaked. He held a family Bible in his weathered hands. The leather binding was cracked and stained, and the pages were full of notes that would make grown men cry. When he held the book above his head, the courtroom fell silent. He promised the jury that this holy book, along with the unshakable testimony of a country doctor, would reveal a sin so deep that it had poisoned the soil of their mountain community. But to really understand the horror that had brought them to this point, you have to go back to the fall of 1884, when the first whispers of something wrong started to spread through the Missouri Ozarks' remote hollows. The Finch homestead was 15 miles from the nearest neighbor. It was a run-down cabin and corn crib that Josiah Finch had built in the woods to raise his conjoined twin daughters, Elspeth and Imogene, in complete privacy since their mother died years before. The sisters, who were now 22 years old and joined at the base of their spines, had become morbidly interesting and sad figures among the few mountain people who saw them. Josiah Finch used to be a regular at Bradshaw's Crossroads store. He was a stern but well-liked widower who ran his business quietly and efficiently before going back to his hollow. But when the leaves turned red in 1884, store owner Marcus Bradshaw wrote in his ledger that Josiah hadn't been seen since early spring. This was a worrying absence that started to make the few families in their small community whisper about what might have happened. The sisters had started going on supply runs by themselves, and their movements were strange and out of sync. People who heard them say the same things over and over again, in perfectly timed, rehearsed phrases that made them shiver. On a hot July afternoon, the Finch sisters went into Bradshaw's store and bought something that would later be used as important evidence in the county prosecutor's case files. They paid with silver coins that looked brand new and suspiciously shiny. They bought a heavy iron padlock that was much stronger and more expensive than anything their simple mountain cabin would need. When Bradshaw casually asked what needed such serious security, both sisters spoke in perfect unison, their voices flat and emotionless. The Lord's work requires protection from the faithless. The storekeeper later said that their synchronized response made his blood run cold, but he couldn't say why at the time. As summer turned into a hot August, circuit preacher Ezra Whitman tried to visit the Finch homestead to check on their welfare because he was worried about how isolated they were becoming. His handwritten diary, which is kept in the County Historical Society archives, shows how shocked he was when the sisters turned him away. They blocked his way to the cabin door and spoke in eerie unison about a holy quarantine that kept people from interfering. Whitman was most disturbed by the strange silence that covered the property like a burial shroud. There were no sounds of livestock, chickens, or even insects, breaking the oppressive silence that seemed to press against his eardrums. The preacher's diary entry from the 23rd of August 1884 would be an important piece of evidence in the legal case that followed. He wrote about the overwhelming sense of wrongness that filled the Finch property. He said that the sisters' eyes had a fanatical gleam that reminded him of rabid animals, and that they moved in a way that made him feel uneasy, as if they were all thinking the same thing instead of acting on their own. What haunted him the most was that both sisters wore heavy woolen shawls that completely covered their bodies, even though it was summer. They also seemed to breathe in perfect sync, as if they were two parts of the same twisted organism. Preacher Whitman was very upset by what happened, so he made a choice that would eventually bring justice to the Finch Hollow. He wrote to Dr. Abraham Clayton, the new circuit physician, to let him know that the Finch women might need medical or spiritual help right away. The letter, which Clayton kept safe and later used as evidence in court, talked about how the sisters seemed to be malnourished, how they acted strangely, and most importantly, how Whitman was sure that there was a terrible secret hidden in that cabin that was like an infected wound. On the 15th of September, 1884, Dr. Clayton got an urgent letter from Whitman. He had no idea that he was being pulled into a web of evil that would test every bit of his medical training and moral courage. The young doctor, who had a leather medical bag and an unshakable belief in reasoning based on evidence, had no idea that his methodical nature and careful record-keeping would be the tools of justice that would finally bring to light the horrible crimes being committed in the Ozark Mountains. On a cold morning in late November 1885, Dr. Abraham Clayton got an urgent call from a breathless farm boy who said one of the Finch sisters was in labor and needed medical help right away. Clayton's medical journal, which is kept in the Missouri State Archives, says that at first he didn't want to go into the remote hollow because he had never seen the conjoined twins before and didn't know much about their condition other than what he had heard. But his oath as a doctor forced him to gather his tools and make the dangerous 15-mile trip through the forest, which was getting thicker and thicker, to the Finch homestead. As Clayton's horse carefully made its way along the barely visible path that led deeper into the mountains, he wrote in his journal about the strange stillness that felt like a physical weight pressing down on him. There were no birds singing in the bare branches above, no small animals moving through the leaves on the ground, and even his horse was getting more and more nervous as they got closer to the hidden cabin. Its ears were pressed against its head. The doctor's written account, which was later used as evidence in court, talks about how he felt like something was very wrong and made his skin crawl, as if the air around the Finch property had been poisoned by some invisible evil. The cabin that appeared out of the morning fog looked like any other cabin from the outside. But Clayton's trained eye quickly picked up on things that made him nervous. The windows were covered with thick canvas instead of glass, and there were strange symbols carved into the wooden doorframe. They looked like biblical text, but were arranged in a way that made them look wrong. What was most disturbing was that there were no signs of normal farm life. There were no chickens pecking in the yard, no hogs wallowing in mud, and no vegetables growing in plots. It was just a creepy cleanliness that made it seem like the sisters had scrubbed away all signs of natural living. When the cabin door opened before he could knock, Clayton saw both Finch sisters. Their faces were pale and gaunt, and their dark eyes had a fanatical gleam that made him instinctively step back. His medical journal goes into great detail about how they looked. Both women looked very malnourished, even though they were obviously pregnant. Their skin was waxy and unhealthy looking, and they moved in the same creepy way that others had described. The most shocking thing for him as a doctor was that both sisters were in active labor and having contractions at the same time, which is biologically impossible and made his trained mind go into overdrive. Clayton's journal entries show how strange the inside of the cabin was to him. Like a physical blow, the floors and walls were scrubbed so clean that they hurt the eyes, but there was a strange display on the stone hearth that looked like an altar. It had corn husks braided into complicated patterns, river stones arranged in geometric shapes, and a family Bible open to passages that had been heavily marked with what looked like dried blood. The doctor's account says that he immediately thought this was not a normal place to give birth, but a ritual space for reasons he couldn't imagine. As Clayton got ready for what should have been routine deliveries, he asked the sisters to get him water to boil his tools. This was a normal medical procedure that would turn out to be a key moment in revealing their crimes. Both women spoke in perfect unison, telling him to get water from a rain barrel outside because their well had supposedly gone bad weeks before. But as Clayton gathered his things and looked through the cabin's only uncovered window, his doctor's eye for detail caught something that made his blood freeze. a clear, well-worn path in the dirt that led not to the abandoned well, but directly to a heavily built corn crib that was locked with the expensive iron padlock the sisters had bought months before. The noise that Clayton heard from that window would stay with him for the rest of his life and be a big part of his sworn testimony. There was a faint but unmistakable rhythmic scraping sound coming from inside the locked corn crib. It sounded like fingernails dragging across rough wood. There was also a weak moaning sound that sounded like a person, but it was so quiet that it was hard to hear over the mountain wind. His medical journal tells the exact moment when the sisters saw him staring at their corn crib with horror. It describes how their synchronized movements suddenly became threatening and their faces twisted into the same angry expression, turning them from pitiful beings into something truly terrifying. As Clayton's medical instincts fought against his growing belief that he had stumbled into a situation far worse than any difficult delivery, the birth of two sickly babies took place in an atmosphere of rising fear. He writes in his journal about how strangely easy it was for both sisters to give birth at the same time, how they didn't act like normal mothers with their newborns, and how they kept calling the babies vessels instead of babies, which is the most disturbing thing of all. When Clayton tried to look at the kids more closely, both sisters became very upset and spoke in a creepy way about protecting the sacred seed from contamination by outsider hands. When the sun rose over the Ozark Mountains, Dr. Clayton realized he was seeing proof of crimes that were beyond both medical and moral understanding. The careful notes he kept in his journal would be the basis for justice to finally be served, even though he couldn't yet imagine how horrible the things he had found in that remote cabin were, where evil had taken root and thrived in total darkness. Dr. Clayton's hands shook as he finished delivering both sickly babies. Their births at the same time went against everything he had learned about medical science during his rigorous training in St. Louis. His journal talks about how the newborns had unnatural strength, how their weak cries sounded more like mewing animals than human babies, and most disturbing of all, how neither sister showed any maternal instinct. They looked at their children like farmers look at livestock. Clayton used water from the rain barrel to clean his tools, and the rhythmic scraping from the locked corn crib kept going. Each sound drove deeper into his mind, like nails being hammered into a coffin. Clayton told the sisters that medical protocol required him to talk to their father about registering the births with county officials. This was the moment that turned suspicion into a criminal investigation. The response was quick and terrifying. Both women got up from their birthing beds with superhuman speed and blocked the cabin door with their bodies, their faces twisting into the same angry mask. Their answer wasn't normal speech. It was a rhythmic, chanted verse that made Clayton's blood freeze. The vessel prepares the seed must feed, the father bleeds what the daughters need. The way their voices moved, together, along with the meaningless but scary words, made the doctor think he was stuck in a den of madness. Clayton's medical journal talks about the moment when he really got scared. He was alone with two women who were clearly in a shared psychosis and were a real threat to his safety. The sisters began to move toward him in a creepy way that was perfectly in sync. Their eyes had the same fanatical gleam he had seen when he first arrived. From the corn crib, he heard another weak moan that confirmed his worst fears about what had happened to Josiah Finch. Clayton calmly gathered his tools while talking to the sisters in a soothing way. He was also thinking about how likely it was that he could get to his horse before they could stop him. Clayton's desperate ride to the county seat turned into a race against time. He pushed his horse through dangerous mountain trails while thinking of the arguments he would need to convince Sheriff Augustus Poole to act right away. His journal tells the whole story of that terrible trip, how his horse seemed to know how urgent it was and moved faster than usual, the bitter wind that cut through his medical coat, and most importantly, how he was becoming more and more sure that every second of delay could mean the difference between rescue and murder for the people locked up in that corn crib. Sheriff Poole's first response was exactly what Clayton had been afraid of. The weathered lawman showed the usual Ozark reluctance to get involved in family matters and questioned whether a city-trained doctor really understood the mountain customs that governed isolated communities like the Finch. Hollow. Poole's written report, which is kept in official records and filed with the county clerk, shows that he didn't believe Clayton's claims. He said that the Finch family had always been seen as strange but harmless, and that making a quick judgment based on medical oddities could ruin an innocent family's reputation for no reason. The turning point came when Clayton opened his leather medical journal and started reading out loud the careful notes he had taken during his scary house call. Poole's official report says that the doctor's thorough notes, which included exact times, medical terms, and objective descriptions of evidence, slowly convinced him that this was not the hysterical overreaction of an inexperienced outsider, but the careful testimony of a trained professional. Clayton's clinical description of the simultaneous births was the most convincing. It was a medical impossibility that hinted at deeper mysteries that needed to be looked into right away. Sheriff Poole put together a group of himself, the doctor, and deputies Samuel Morrison and Jacob Wheeler, all of whom were armed and ready for trouble within 2 hours of Clayton's arrival. Poole's report said that the 4 men were grimly determined as they rode back to the Finch Hollow, which was like a military mission. They were going to what might be a crime scene of unprecedented horror. The sheriff's written account says that the oppressive silence seemed to get thicker as they got closer to the cabin. The only sounds were the horses' hooves and the moaning that got louder and louder coming from the corn crib. The fight that would finally reveal the full extent of the Finch family's crimes started when the 4 police officers found both sisters standing in the cabin doorway like guards, their bodies forming a human wall that kept anyone from getting to their property. Poole's official report shows that they all had the same defiant looks on their faces, moved in a way that looked choreographed rather than natural, and most frighteningly, they didn't seem surprised at all when armed police arrived, as if they had been expecting it and were ready for it. When Sheriff Poole told them to move out of the way, both sisters started chanting the same rhythmic verse they had used to scare Dr. Clayton. Their voices rose and fell in perfect harmony, and they never took their eyes off the men who had come to destroy their twisted world. The sound of pain that came from the locked corn crib at that exact moment made it clear that something needed to be done right away. Deputy Morrison's sworn statement, which is now part of the court record, describes a low, animal-like moan of pain that could only come from a person in a lot of pain, followed by the unmistakable sound of chains rattling against wooden walls. Both sisters screamed in anger when Sheriff Poole told them to break the lock, but the 4 armed men easily overpowered their resistance. Deputy Wheeler used an axe to break the expensive padlock that had kept whatever horrors were inside safe. The broken wood of the corn crib door fell off like a dam breaking, letting out a smell so bad that Deputy Wheeler threw up right away and fell to the ground. What used to be Josiah Finch sat inside the small building, chained to a central post with heavy iron shackles. His once strong body was now thin and skeletal. His clothes were torn, and his eyes had the blank look of a man whose mind had been systematically shattered. Sheriff Poole's official report goes into great detail about the victim's condition. He was severely malnourished, had infected wounds on his wrists and ankles from the restraints, and couldn't speak clearly. He could only whisper broken words about the holy work and purification through suffering. Dr. Clayton started examining the rescued man right away, and his professional opinion was recorded in sworn testimony that would be very important in court. Josiah's physical state indicated months of systematic abuse, intentional starvation, enforced confinement, and indications of recurrent sexual assault that challenged the experienced physician's ability to sustain clinical composure. Clayton was most worried about the victim's mental state. Josiah went from being terrified of the police to seeming religiously ecstatic when he talked about being chosen for the sacred vessel and blessed with the burden of creation. Sheriff Poole focused on searching the cabin for evidence that could explain the horrible crimes they had found, while deputies Morrison and Wheeler carefully freed Josiah from his chains and got him ready to be taken to town. The sisters stood in silence, their identical faces showing no remorse or concern for their father's health. Instead, they were coldly angry that outsiders who couldn't understand their divine mission had interrupted their holy work. Their complete lack of normal human emotion in the face of such suffering was a chilling sign of their shared descent into madness. When Sheriff Poole looked at the family Bible that had been put on display on the cabin's makeshift altar, he found the key to understanding the full extent of the Finch family's crimes. The leather-bound book looked normal on the outside, but when you opened it, you saw that the pages had been systematically defiled with notes, additions, and complete rewrites of sacred texts that turned Holy Scripture into a guide for incestuous breeding. In his written report, Poole talks about how horrified he was to find that every page of Genesis had been changed with brown ink that forensic analysis would later show to be human blood. The annotated Bible's twisted theology gave police a clear timeline and reason for the crimes that happened in the remote hollow. The sisters had rewritten the story of creation to make incest seem like God's plan for keeping bloodlines pure. They wrote by hand that the daughters of Adam must return to the source, and sacred seed requires sacred soil to flourish. A detailed calendar that showed months of planning was the most damning piece of evidence. It had specific dates marked for rituals, confinement periods, and the blessed impregnation that would create what they called sanguine root children who would carry on their twisted legacy. Page after page showed the methodical madness that had taken over both sisters. They used biblical verses about lineage and tribal purity to justify imprisoning and repeatedly attacking their own father. The book had very specific instructions for keeping Josiah captive, such as when to feed him, clean him, and do what they called purification rituals, which were clearly descriptions of systematic rape meant to make babies. Sheriff Poole's report says that some pages were so disturbing that he had trouble reading them out loud to his deputies. The arrest of Elspeth and Imogene Finch went on with an eerie calm that made all 4 lawmen uneasy. The sisters didn't fight back when they were handcuffed, and they kept moving and talking in perfect unison. Their only statement, which was recorded word for word in official court records, showed that they were completely sure they had done nothing wrong. "You have interrupted God's work and doomed the world to impurity. The sanguine root will rise again when faithful servants complete what we have begun." The chilling certainty in their voices, along with their identical expressions of righteous anger, were the last pieces of evidence needed to prove their shared psychotic delusion. As the rescue team got ready to take the victims and the criminals back to the county seat, Dr. Clayton made one last discovery that would put the Finch sisters in jail. There were more papers hidden under the cabin's floorboards, wrapped in oiled cloth. They explained how they planned to expand their holy breeding program to include other families in the area that were cut off from the rest of the world. These papers, written in the same blood ink used to mark up the Bible, had lists of possible victims and detailed plans for converting other mountain communities to their twisted faith. This showed that the terrible things found in Finch Hollow were meant to be just the start of a much bigger campaign of religious terror. As Sheriff Poole's group made their way down the mountain trails, they continued to carefully document all of the physical evidence. This evidence would be used in the legal proceedings that would finally bring justice to this remote part of the Missouri Ozarks. The Bible with notes, Josiah's chains, the sisters' written confessions of faith, and Dr. Clayton's medical testimony would all come together to make an unbreakable case for prosecution. This would make sure that the evil that had been allowed to grow in isolation would face the full force of civilized justice. On the 15th of February, 1886, the trial of Elspeth and Imogene Finch began in a Tenney County courthouse that was so full of spectators that it was beyond capacity. People had come from all over southern Missouri to see what local newspapers called the most depraved case in Ozark history. Prosecutor William Hartwell's opening statement, which is still available in full court transcripts, carefully laid out the evidence that would show the sisters had broken laws that went against both human decency and natural law. His promise to the jury was simple and terrible. The Commonwealth would show beyond a doubt that 2 women had systematically imprisoned, starved, and sexually assaulted their own father while using a twisted religious doctrine that turned the Holy Bible into a guide for incestuous breeding to justify their actions. On the second day of testimony, Dr. Abraham Clayton took the stand. He held his medical journal tightly in his hands as he gave what court watchers said was the most convincing expert testimony ever heard in a Missouri courtroom. His clinical account of the impossible simultaneous births, the terrible conditions he found at the Finch homestead, and his thorough medical examination of Josiah's injuries gave the jury clear scientific proof of long-term abuse. Clayton's professional opinion that both sisters showed clear signs of shared psychotic delusion was the most damaging to the defense. Their synchronized movements and identical responses showed that they were completely out of touch with reality, which made them very dangerous to society. On the third day, Sheriff Augustus Poole's testimony gave the police's point of view that turned medical suspicions into criminal facts. They read aloud his official report, which gave a detailed account of everything that happened, from Dr. Clayton's first alarm to the dramatic rescue at the corn crib. As Poole talked about finding Josiah Finch chained up like an animal, the packed courtroom went silent in horror. His body showed signs of months of systematic torture and sexual assault that had turned a once proud mountain man into a broken shell of a person. The sheriff's account of the sisters' complete lack of remorse, their strange synchronized behavior, and their chilling comments about interrupting God's work showed how sure they were that their crimes were right. When Prosecutor Hartwell showed the annotated family Bible as evidence and read passages that had been rewritten in human blood to show that incestuous breeding was a command from God, the courtroom gasped in disgust. As Hartwell explained how the sisters had systematically twisted sacred scripture, turning the story of creation into a guide for keeping bloodline purity through father-daughter reproduction, the jurors visibly recoiled. Page after page showed how carefully they planned their crimes, with detailed calendars marking ritual dates and clear instructions for keeping their father captive that made it clear they were guilty and had dangerous delusions. On the fourth day, Josiah Finch himself took the witness stand. Dr. Clayton held him up as he gave testimony that made even the toughest people in the room cry. This was the moment that sealed the sisters' fate. Even though Josiah was mentally broken, he gave a clear account of his months in captivity. He described in broken whispers how his own daughters had chained him in the corn crib and sexually assaulted him over and over while chanting about creating sacred vessels and purifying the bloodline. The Ateln court stenographer recorded his testimony verbatim, which included specific details about the rituals performed on him, the starvation used to weaken his resistance, and the twisted religious justifications his daughters used during their assaults. The sisters' testimony, which was perfectly timed, was the most damaging evidence against the defense. Elspeth and Imogene stood together at the defendant's table and read their statement in perfect harmony, their voices rising and falling in a creepy way as they defended their actions not as crimes but as obedience to God. Their chilling performance, in which they called their father a willing vessel and their children sacred fruit, showed the horrified jury that both women were still completely sure they were right and would keep committing crimes if they had the chance. The jury took less than 2 hours to reach a decision. They found the sisters guilty but criminally insane, which meant that they would never hurt another person again. Judge Harrison McCrady's sentence, which is still in the court records, sent both women to Missouri's State Lunatic Asylum No. 3 for the rest of their lives. This kept them out of society, while also recognizing that they were mentally ill. The packed courtroom erupted in applause when justice was finally served. The evil that had been hidden away was brought to light and kept there for good. The First Baptist Church of Forsyth took care of Josiah Finch for the rest of his life. The church gave him a place to stay, food, and spiritual comfort as he tried to recover from what had happened to him. Church records show that he lived quietly for 2 more years, but he never fully recovered his mental health. He died of pneumonia in the winter of 1888. The death certificate he filed with Tenney County said he died of natural causes, but people who knew him knew he died from wounds that would never heal. The Finch sisters died just hours apart in November 1899. They were both mentally ill, and their illness lasted until the end of their lives at the state asylum. The Missouri wilderness has taken back the place where they committed their crimes, and only a few scattered stones mark where their cabin used to be. Tenney County court documents are a permanent record of the past that show that justice will eventually find those who prey on the innocent, even in the most remote parts of America. This proves that evil cannot stay hidden in the dark forever.